Hello and welcome to the TF1 show. I'm your host, Tinus, the clown that keeps this ridiculous motorsport fueled circus that is the TF1 show, all fueled up and right on the apex of the corner. Now, today's episode is pretty much a continuation of last week where we recapped and discussed, the past week in F1 testing. So today's episode is basically the second part of our discussion around Formula 1 testing, where we will discuss the last 3 days basically of everything that transpired. Now, if we take a quick jump back to the last week's episode, I said that this final week of testing will separate the men from the boys and that we will finally get a better idea of where everybody stands relative to each other. Now, what we got instead was the world's most messed up and convoluted game of Cluedo, where you have lots of scattered pieces of clues, but no conclusive evidence of where everyone stands. It was 3 days of deception, of intrigue, of subterfuge. It was just very confusing for me. But nevertheless, I will soldier on and I'll try and give you my best sense of where everybody currently is and how everybody stands relative to each other. And I think the most important things that we need to look out for when we get to Melbourne. And I think let's jump straight into the team that has probably provided the most confusion over the past couple of days, and that is most definitely Ferrari, because I personally expected them to show their hand a bit more over the last couple of days. Just, turn up the engine, do 1 or 2 quick low fuel laps, give us a better indication of where they are truly relative to Red Bull and Mercedes specifically. But what we instead got was a barrage of conflicting and contrasting information from Mattia Binotto, the team principal, where on the one hand he kept saying that, no, what we're seeing now is their true performance, and this is basically what they have, and this is how good they can go in terms of their car's performance. But then on the other hand, he said, well, they haven't really turned up the engine because they don't want to overstress it and that they're focusing on reliability. So basically, they are severely underpowered compared to the rest at the moment. Therefore, their times aren't representative at all. Now, and I'll get into the engine situation a bit later, but it's just all very grey and muddled at the moment for Ferrari, where every now and again we saw that they had a bit of a flicker of hope or a bit of a turn of speed, and then for the next 2 hours after that, basically back to just running laps slowly around Barcelona, according to them, just sort of experimenting on setup and understanding the car, which is all good and well. But I would have imagined part of understanding the car would be to really get an idea of how this car performs on low fuel and with, maximum power, given that qualifying is such an important part of Formula 1 and a race weekend in general. So a bit of a confusing situation there for Ferrari from my perspective. Also a bit difficult for me to really gauge how the drivers are feeling about it. Charles Leclerc seemed relatively relaxed. He basically also said that they haven't shown their full hand yet. Sebastian Vettel came out and said some things are improved. Their mission statement from last year into this year was to improve their overall downforce of the car and improve their performance in slow corners. And he came out and said that they've definitely matched those targets and have reached those goals, which I guess is good for them. But that has then come at the cost of drag, where they say that their car is a lot draggier than what it was last year, which is, I guess, a natural consequence of running higher downforce. And that therefore means that on the straights they are a lot slower compared to last year, compounding, I guess, the impact of running the engine at a lower power setting. But now the interesting thing is that they're saying is that actually the trade-off that they've made in terms of drag versus downforce has been too big. So they somehow need to reduce the drag of the car while still maintaining the downforce levels. And I think that's sort of been the tough nut to crack for them, where they need to somehow find that sweet spot between drag and downforce, where last year they were too much on the draggy side, and this year it seems, just from the noises we're getting from testing, that they are more on the downforce side of things. And I think maybe teams like Red Bull and Mercedes have moved closer to that sweet spot between drag and downforce. But I guess we'll see, we'll get a better sense at a track with a bit of a longer straight, something like that Barcelona doesn't really have. I guess if we get to Bahrain, we'll get a better sense of how these cars stack up in terms of straight line speed, engine power, and then overall dragginess, I guess. Now, I guess one of the big, I don't really want to call it a bombshell, because it was sort of a little tidbit of information dropped 10 minutes before the final day of testing got finished. And that's basically the news around the FIA and Ferrari's engine from last year, where the FIA came out and said that they basically concluded the investigation on the controversial engine that Ferrari ran last year. For those who don't remember, obviously Red Bull and Mercedes specifically were very upset about the massive power advantage that Ferrari seemed to have over the second half of last year especially, and they they've sort of forced the FIA to issue a lot of technical directives around what's allowed and not allowed on the engine, and all sorts of fuel burning or manipulation of the fuel flow meter was subsequently banned and was subsequently made illegal. And we did see some changes in the overall Ferrari straight line speed, but at that point in time it was chalked down to them running a higher downforce setup and therefore increasing drag of the car, and that obviously affects the straight line speed. But now the FIA came out and said that they have now concluded their full investigation of the Ferrari engine, which they seized at the end of last year to do their own, substantive testing on. And they came out and said that after this investigation, they have reached a settlement with Ferrari internally that will not be divulged, and that also, Ferrari is going to assist them in all sorts of endeavors around biofuels and sustainable, ensuring sustainability of the sport and things like that. But all in all, very strange timing of this announcement and very strange wording and overall sort of messaging from the FIA, where it came across very cagey. It came across as them sort of popping in this little tidbit of info while nobody was looking to sort of say, oh yeah, just by the way, this thing is done now, but we've concluded it and let's put this matter to rest. And I think what they achieved was exactly the opposite, because, everybody reacted quite uproariously when this news was broken, just because of how secretive the whole story was. The FIA never clarified whether the engine was legal or not. The wording in it somehow made it seem like it wasn't, or that they found some dubious issues on the engine, but maybe not conclusive enough for them to outright fine the team, or I don't know. It seemed a bit interesting. And then after that, then more rumors came out about the fact that the reason for Ferrari's engine or Ferrari straight line speed specifically being such a problem in testing so far was the fact that Ferrari had to make large scale changes to the internal combustion engine in order to now fully comply with the regulations after the investigation from the FIA. And now, whether this is the truth or not, I don't know. I think I'm going to err more on the side of saying that it's more rumor than truth, just because I think if Ferrari had to rebuild the whole engine, I think it would have been a massive, massive undertaking, and that they probably would have been further behind than what they are. If you look at the customer teams from Ferrari, they still seem to have a relatively good turn of pace, but it just seemed like the Ferrari team is running with a turned down engine setting. So I think this is definitely one of the key things we need to look out for when we get to Melbourne, is to understand what's going on with Ferrari's engine. Where is Ferrari fitting in the pecking order? Because at the moment, it's difficult to really get a sense of where they are, given that we would expect them to be up there with Mercedes and Red Bull. But a lot of people are saying that they're probably going to be racing with, the Racing Point team for that low podium position or third best team on the grid. So I'm going to be interested to see whether it actually turns out to be the case, or whether it's just a classic case of people throwing out the baby with the bathwater and Ferrari actually not being that far off after all. Alright, let's maybe move on to Red Bull, who also had a bit of an interesting second week of testing. Now, I think the news from testing and from, all of the journalists and senior know-how people in Barcelona said that consistently the Red Bull has looked like probably the fastest car in the medium to fast, type corners. It looked very planted, looked very good on turn in. It looked like a very impressive car. And that trend continued during the last 3 days of testing, where the Red Bull has impressed a lot. Obviously, similar to Ferrari, they've very much not shown their full hand, but they have run into a couple of difficulties, specifically with, they had a few reliability problems. Unfortunately, mostly on Alex Albon's, not Alex Albon's car, but during the Alex Albon sessions, which I think is a pity for him, because I think he's probably the guy that needs the most running time in that car to really, for the first time, actually test it and get a better understanding of how that car is supposed to work. And the second issue that they seem to have was Max Verstappen was spinning all over the place, especially in turn 5 on the track. And Albon, I think, also had a bit of a spin over the last couple of days of testing, which, posed the question, is that Red Bull maybe a bit of a tricky car to drive, especially on the limits? It seems to have a bit of an unstable rear end. Don't know if that's by design or whether that's just the team trying to explore different setups and explore different configurations of the car. So definitely something I also think to look out for when we get to Melbourne is whether that Red Bull, it's definitely a fast car. I think that's well established. But how easy is it to access that speed? If even, a driver of Max Verstappen's caliber can't always keep that car on the track, and, if that car loses a bit of control. So that's going to be an interesting thing to explore. Another thing that Red Bull came with for the second week of testing was a massive amount of upgrades. They upgraded their front wing. They added updates to their barge boards. Now it looks quite aggressive. It looks like a razor blade down the side of the car, similar to Mercedes. They say allegedly that upgrade package adds about 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. Don't know if that's the truth. But Red Bull seem pretty happy with the upgrade, and the probably chances are we're going to see them keep it like that for Australia, maybe with a more bits and, couple of bits and pieces, that they'll bring, to Melbourne for the first time. So I think overall Red Bull looks really, really good at this point in time. Probably I'd say the main challenger to Mercedes in Australia. It's going to be really interesting to see, when they finally go head to head properly, whether the Red Bull might actually have the advantage over the Mercedes. So, lots to look forward to there. And, I can't wait to see what they actually produce in Melbourne. Alright, now let's talk about the final third of this triad of excellence at the front of Formula One. And this is probably, I think, consensus, definitely alludes to this. Mercedes is the team to beat going into Australia. Now, obviously, we all got a bit burnt at the beginning of last year when we said exactly this about Ferrari. But I think, Mercedes is too good a team to be caught out like that. Or I at least feel that they're too good a team to be caught out like that. So I think Mercedes is probably the favorites. They've looked incredibly fast, incredibly consistent. Especially their long run pace was very, very fast. I think the first time we saw a long run come sort of relatively close to what Lewis Hamilton did last week in testing was Sebastian Vettel's, I think, long run. Oh, no, probably Charles Leclerc's long run now during the second period of testing. I think it was the second to last day. That was actually quite an impressive long run from Leclerc, which I guess also hinted a bit at the speed that the Ferrari potentially has. But back to Mercedes, I think that car looks fast over one lap. It looks fast in long run pace. The team looks to be supremely confident. They seem to have basically run through their whole program. Hamilton, given that he doesn't really like winter testing ever, he was in incredibly high spirits. He says the car feels amazing and that he feels pretty confident. But now for a team that's gone that well at testing, there's very much still a bit of a dark cloud hanging over their testing performance, and that has been their reliability issues with the engine, where they've had a couple of MGUK failures in the first week, and now in the second week of testing, Hamilton had an oil pressure problem the one night or the one afternoon, and Williams also had, I think Williams went through 3 engines on their own, where, on Nicholas Latifi's engine, they've had some difficulties as well, which obviously is supplied by Mercedes. So Hamilton came out and said after the test that he's definitely concerned. There's definitely things to be worried about around the reliability, but that he has full faith in the team, Andy Cowell and the Mercedes HPP team, to sort out these problems before they get to Melbourne. They still did the most laps out of everybody during the 6 days of testing. So I think there is some inherent reliability in that car still. I think now it's just a matter of ironing out, those small little issues to get the ultimate reliability that they had, especially last year, where they had almost no failures on the works Mercedes car. So all in all, a very impressive performance. We saw a bit less of the DAS action, the dual axis steering, over the second week of the testing. Don't know how they're planning to use it in Australia, whether they're going to use it in qualifying, whether they're going to use it in the race predominantly. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But what I do like about Mercedes is just the fact that they're so upfront about what they've changed on the car. James Allison, I think, is a wonderful technical director, and he's always so open about some of the changes that they've been making, some of the new innovations on the car. They seem to be very proud about their rear suspension specifically, where they've made some very interesting changes about, the layout of the arms of the rear suspension and the opportunities that affords them in terms of hunting more downforce at the rear of the car. So I think Mercedes definitely the class of the field after the winter test, but I guess the stopwatch never lies. So we'll see at the end of Melbourne whether all of our predictions and all of our speculation actually turned out to be correct. Cool. Now let's move on to the midfield, and I guess the surprise of the midfield, Racing Point. Now, if you listened to last week's episode, you would remember I already spoken about the fact that Racing Point went to a bit of a copy and paste approach with last year's Mercedes car, and this week's testing basically reinforced the notion that what they've done is actually a very, very clever thing, given that I think it's pretty much consensus across the paddock that Racing Point's probably the best of the rest in terms of, the Class B championship in Formula One. And a lot of people are potentially thinking that Racing Point might actually be able to challenge Ferrari during Melbourne, which would be an incredible achievement by the team if that's the case. Not quite sure how much I believe that yet. I think there's still a chance that Ferrari is hiding enough in order for them to still be a bit of a distance ahead of Racing Point. But just if you think about the improvement that they seem to have made from last year to this year, I think it's a remarkable achievement by a team that's always sort of been the underdogs and have always very much have done the most. Have done the most with what they have. So very excited to see how they progress. They seem to have a real turn of pace, so it's going to be interesting to see how they stack up, and then especially given how they stack up against McLaren and Renault, given that those are the two teams that are probably the most unhappy about the fact that Racing Point produced this sort of Mercedes clone. And there are definitely going to be questions asked if Racing Point does turn out to be much faster than McLaren and Renault. And I guess that's the perfect segue into maybe talking about those two teams. Now, for me, it's actually quite difficult to get a good grip on how McLaren and Renault have been going. McLaren are making all sorts of positive noises where they say that this is the best winter testing they've had in years. They're feeling very comfortable and very confident with their car, and obviously still some things to correct and some things to improve. But they feel that they have set a very good baseline for their, for the season. They've, I think, done the third most laps out of all the teams after Ferrari and Mercedes. So they are pretty confident that they've gathered the sufficient data to actually be able to go on a proper development path and to set up the car in the way that they need to. They were also a team that brought a couple of upgrades to the second week of testing. I think they brought an updated front wing, an updated floor and diffuser. So after, they ran a bit of a basic version of the car during week 1 of testing to sort of lay the baseline, and then when they get to week 2, they'll bring some bits to really see and analyze the actual aerodynamic map, if you can call it that, of the car. And the similar story for Renault. Obviously, Renault, I think, made a bit more of a dramatic change to their car design philosophy compared to last year, with the new slim nose and a much more Mercedes Red Bull type approach to the front wing, which might stand them in good stead. I think the noises from the paddock were also quite positive, and that Renault has definitely made a big step in terms of their performance. How that step compares to McLaren Racing Point, that's, I think, going to be the question. My suspicion or my thought is that it's probably going to be those 3 teams heading up the midfield, and they're probably going to be the teams fighting for the points most consistently. But how they're going to stack up relative to each other, it's just way too difficult to tell. I think they're going to be pretty close. I think it's going to be very track dependent. Which track plays to the specific strength of each car, and that's maybe going to determine how they stack up. But lots to look forward to. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how those teams compete against each other. And then you can throw a wild card in the mix like AlphaTauri, which has also been pretty happy with their progress over the winter tests. I think they've taken on some more parts from the Red Bull senior team, which obviously in most cases help them. So, you never know, maybe AlphaTauri can also, be dropped into those top 3, if you can call it midfield teams, and cause a bit of chaos. Now, the last 3 teams that I want to speak about is obviously Alfa Romeo, Haas and Williams. I'd say Alfa Romeo and Haas are probably the 2 teams that I know the least about of, how they feel about their performance. Have they met their targets? How are they feeling in terms of their, standing versus the other teams? Alfa Romeo were trialing some interesting new aerodynamic devices. They had a very extreme version of their front wing, a very interesting rear wing as well. Don't actually know whether they're happy with those or not. Antonio Giovinazzi unfortunately crashed with the rear wing, so I don't know whether they were actually able to gather the required information for them to make a decision on it. But both Alfa Romeo and Haas very much in the dark. Actually don't have much to say. I'm assuming Haas went about trying to really make double check, triple check that they don't make the same mistake as last year, where they thought they had a good car and then pitched up after the first couple of races and realized that actually there's some massive aerodynamic flaws in their car, which meant that the car was essentially undrivable on race day. So definitely hoping that Haas can sort out those fundamental problems, and that they spent a lot of time doing that, so that when they get to Melbourne, they can actually put in a decent effort and just have a more predictable car in terms of how its performance will be from race weekend to race weekend. And lastly, Williams, I think what we can say is that they will be in the midfield fight at least. Whether they're going to be higher than 10th or 9th, unsure, probably not. I think they have already done a very good job just to lift themselves up from that, Class C independent world that they were operating in last year, and just to be back in the thick of things and be doing competitive times, compared to, Haas and Alfa Romeo and the like. Now, George Russell has made a lot of positive noises about this year's Williams, just saying that in terms of driving, it's so much better and so much easier to actually drive the car compared to the one that they had last year. So I think that in itself is very positive for the team, and I really do hope that they can at least here and there, if the opportunity presents itself, score a couple of points. Okay, those are my thoughts on, all of the teams and testing in general. Please, if you want to talk to me about it further, reach out to me on Twitter, reach out to me on Instagram. Happy to chat further and to have a bit of a discussion. I have a couple of more things I want to talk about on this episode. The first being just the Drive to Survive season on Netflix. I've started watching it. I think I'm now I've one episode left, I think, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I think it's, obviously here and there's a bit of a liberty taken with some of the storytelling. And I find this fake commentator that they have during the race scenes to be a bit amusing, given that the commentator always happens to talk about the subjects of the episode, which I guess is convenient for them, even though we know is probably fake and definitely fake. And really that wasn't probably the narrative that was going on during that race weekend. But, that's a small price to pay for, I think, the overall marketing capability of a show like this. I really like the behind the scenes things. Obviously some of it is a bit manufactured still. Actually Max Verstappen came out and said, after, Drive to Survive season 2 was released, and he said that he didn't like the way he was portrayed in the Red Bull sort of centric episodes. When it was talking about, him versus Pierre Gasly and that whole drama around the Gasly demotion, and that Max Verstappen basically said he didn't like the way he was portrayed, and that it's not really the way he is, but, for the sake of the story, that's the way it was presented. And I guess that's always going to be the way of show business, and he's just going to have to deal with that, I guess. I think, in terms of, explaining the whole Nico Hülkenberg situation, I found the Pierre Gasly storyline very interesting. Some of the radio messaging, you feel proper bad for the guy given everything that happened last year. And this Drive to Survive episodes just adds the bit of context and the bit of background that we maybe didn't have at the time of this all happening. So a very fascinating look into what goes on and all of the behind the scenes action of these controversial moments, I guess, of the 2019 F1 season. And I'll encourage all of you, please, if you haven't watched it, go and watch it. Please tell your non-Formula 1 friends, go and encourage them to watch it. I think it's a great way of getting people interested in F1 and getting people to maybe invest in Formula 1 a bit more. I think it's amazing what a show like this on Netflix can do for marketing, and I think especially in a country like the USA, really give the sport a bit of exposure. All right, now before I finish off today's episode, there's one last thing that I want to talk about, and I'm very excited about this. I want to officially launch the TF1 F1 Official Fantasy League. I know that doesn't make any sense, but stay with me. So, for those of you that don't know, the Formula 1 universe or the Formula 1 world has basically started an official F1 Fantasy League competition. And I think the first time they held it was last year. But for this year, I've decided to start our own TF1 Official League. And all of you guys that listens and that tunes into the podcast, please encourage you guys to join. I'll post all of the details on my social media pages, and I'll also, at the footnote of this episode, I'll also include a link and maybe, the code for you guys to actually go and find the league on the F1 website. But essentially how it works is, I pick a team of a couple of drivers and one, race team. And that team basically similar to, maybe to how football fantasy league works. After every race, all of your players in your team essentially gets rated and gets ranked, and you can buy and sell players. It's a bit of a complicated story, so I'm not going to bore you guys with the rules now. But all of it is available on the F1 website. But I've basically decided I'm going to I've already set up my 3 teams. I've created the league. It's on the Formula 1 website. So please, if you guys want to join, search for it on the F1 website. When you sign into F1 Fantasy League, you can go search for the TF1 Show F1 League. And as I've mentioned before, I'll post the exact details on all of my social media pages. So please, guys, if you're keen, come join me. It's going to be really fun. There'll definitely be some sort of award or some sort of perk for whoever does the best, whoever can maybe beat me and my 3 unstoppable teams that I've put together already. Yeah, if you guys are keen, please go join. And if you don't know how to join, send me a DM on Twitter. Happy to help out and to get you guys as part of the league. Well, there you go. There you have it, ladies and gents. We are basically 2 weeks away from the first Grand Prix of the season, and let me tell you, I cannot wait. There is, however, a bit of a black cloud looming over these first few races in the form of the coronavirus, where there's quite a lot of uncertainty around how teams are going to be able to travel around the world. Now, I will of course keep you all updated on Twitter, so please keep a lookout. We'll chat again soon. Bye.